Okay, so thanks to Meg and the other panelists for their challenging and thought-provoking presentations. Thanks also for being succinct. I think we're basically on schedule, and according to our outline, have maybe 25 minutes for comments and questions. So.
I'm curious because I was thinking about, in the spirit of Richard Florida's Who's Your City, that I was going to ask you, what color is your Kool-Aid? And that I'm curious that when it comes towards talking about, if you will, the shining cities on a hill, that Patrick, you hit upon some examples that as much as Vancouver tries being the greenest city on Earth-ish, maybe in the universe or something, what are the signs of hope? I mean, you touch upon hope, and I really want you to kind of draw upon, what does hope look like in all of this, in the absolute dire, depressing stuff that I read sometimes of Bill's work, and how I want to just go into some kind of cave with tuna gun and a gold and just kind of camp out there. What might that look like?
I'll jump in, and it gives me a chance to reinforce the idea of showing Amsterdam and Berlin and Copenhagen was not to say that we should look like them. It was to say they have even density with distributed land uses that are served by modest transportation vehicles in relative terms. And their performance is better than ours is even imagined to be in many measurables. My only point is that we can expect to have an opportunity to add, just in the city of Vancouver, 500,000 people, if we want to. We can expect to have an opportunity to add 1.5 million in the region if we want to. And if we waste that as the building blocks, as the Lego pieces for a sustainable region, it would be a tragedy. I happen to think that we're wasting that opportunity now, partly driven by this gleaming blue glass tower on the shore image, not so much on the hill, but very much on the shore, which is eruptions of opportunities to capture global capital connected by SkyTrains. And I think that's not necessarily the best way to use this opportunity.
Just a couple of points. Is this working? First of all, I'd like to remind you that I'm not here to pronounce gloom and doom. I'm saying the track we are on is taking us there. And I'm trying to highlight the opportunity for an alternative vision that will steer us away from that track. So the first step in moving forward is to understand where you are and where you've come from, which brings me to a couple of comments about Patrick's presentation. The cities he talked about, Amsterdam, Copenhagen, Berlin, and so on, are cities that evolved in place over very long periods of time in the absence of abundant, cheap energy. They are the products of their own history. The pointy cities of Los Angeles and Vancouver and New York are cities that evolved in a period of abundant, cheap energy. They are the product of their history. And it may be a lot easier than we think to go toward the flat city that Patrick pointed out if the statistics on energy and indeed climate change come about. We're not going to be able to use the energy we've got, or we may not have it in the first place, so that the circumstances of our economy and society as they evolve over the next 3 days may take us toward the flat city and away from the pointy one, whether we like it or not. Now, my point is that we should grasp this as that opportunity to move in a direction that creates a reasonably equitable, not only livable, but sustainable city while we have the chance. Because if we continue to think, as Ottawa is and Victoria seems to think, that the next 50 and 60 years are going to be a simple extension of the past 50 or 60 years, we might as well give it up and take Meg's exit strategy to heart. So look, I'm so optimistic I can't see straight sometimes. But it requires knowing what's going on out there in order to fit yourself into that place.
Okay, well, I'll just say one thing, and that is I mentioned the targets issue, and so did Cornelia. The thing that gives me hope is that the cities like the city of Vancouver aim for things like One Planet Living. It's in the Greenest City Action Plan, and regardless of knowing if they can get there or not, at least they had the guts to say, we need to do this, or we'd like to try this. And I think that one of the lessons that I learned from my research is that you actually can surprise yourself if you set a stretch goal. You might not get there, but if you're too afraid to try, which is also a history we've had about not being bold in setting targets and then not committing to trying, that's really the sadness in this whole discussion about the future of the region. So the fact that we're all still here, you know, you look around the room, look at the wealth of people who've been at this for 30, 40 years, we're still here having this conversation. To me, that's a sign of hope, and the willingness to just put your peg out there and say, okay, we're gonna try this. Let's find out if we can do it. That's hopeful.
I really found that very interesting what Meg was saying about being a city in decline, and I actually agree with that. But I also actually see there's real opportunities in that, and I'm just wondering if people could comment on what opportunities you would see in sort of reframing what, you know, what is possible now.
Sure, I can take a start maybe. I mean, when you look at what the biggest predictor of people's greenhouse gas emissions profile is, it's income, right? So I actually see, you know, I'm looking forward to declines in flows of capital through Vancouver because it will force, and not because I'm self-flagellating and looking forward to not being able to eat at restaurants and coffee, but we'll learn to grow it, right? So I'm looking forward to the social opportunities within these, you know, these sorts of constraints, which were the constraints on which what many of us consider to be the great cities of the world were constructed. I think, you know, some of the work in the sharing economy, although there's lots of critical assessment needed, are really promising in that direction.
I would just add to that ideas like the sharing economy are ideas that have been around for quite a while, and people were positing those again, just to go back to Southeast Falls Creek. And the fact that the ideas continue and people keep working them and they come back up, I think that's very hopeful looking forward. I just would reiterate what Jenny mentioned about target setting, and the Greenest City Action Plan sets targets, including the footprint target. And it's critical we do that because it gives us an idea of where we're trying to move to, even if that final goal or that final target is not one we can accurately measure. We really need some kind of direction setting there.
Just a couple of things about decline. Again, it's a fuzzy kind of concept. We are currently in a society which is dedicated to the twin myths of perpetual progress and unlimited economic growth. The object of the exercise is that we all feel better the richer we are, and that we can eliminate poverty through growth only. There isn't a shred of evidence to support either of those propositions. If you look at just Canada from 1976 to 2006, the real growth in the economy is 130%. Per capita income increased 70%. During that period of time, the amount of unemployment and poverty remained constant or fell slightly. Another trend that I think is remarkable is that the numbers of Canadians who report themselves as being happy or very happy was in steady decline through the entire period. In fact, if you look at those kinds of social science surveys, which are taken regularly in North America, the happiest decade that this continent ever enjoyed were the 1950s, when incomes were less than 50% in real terms of what they are today. So maybe decline is a good thing if we rediscover those things that make us, in fact, truly human, such as community, neighborhood, in relationship, social capital, and all of the rest of it. Now again, to me, the data are there. We can do it socially. We can even, for that matter, with off-the-shelf technology, achieve an 80% reduction in most energy use. It's simply going to a passive house standard for every new building would result in every new building in this city having 15% of the energy consumption of the average building going up right now. That's an 80% reduction, 85% reduction right there. We can go on and on. Read the book, Factor 5, how to get 5 times the productivity out of the input of energies and materials that we have right now. Everything is possible. If we lose sight of the ball, however, and give in to the vocalizations of transnational capital that want to maintain the suicidal train. We're all on a train shoveling coal, as one of my friends wrote a book called Shoveling Coal on a Runaway Train. That's what we're doing. It's really quite insane. The only remarkable things that distinguish humans from any other species is the capacity for high intelligence, reasoning from the evidence, and then applying that to planning ahead. In other words, to change the future into something you might actually like. Now, those are two unique qualities which we are abandoning as a matter of public policy in this country. And we sit back as voters and put up with it. What kind of nonsense is that? It belies the fact that there's any intelligent life on Earth, frankly.
Ditto.
Thanks for your presentation. My question is about construction waste. And I am astonished by how often we hear someone say something like, this building is 40 years old, we need to tear it down and replace it, it's ancient. And I'm curious, why isn't building durability something we talk about when we develop green building standards?
Okay. Well, first of all, it is something we do talk about a lot. So people that are in building sciences do look at the durability of buildings and the ability for the building to have many lives and flex over time. But there's also an industry market driver around increasing the square footage of a building, which is in the residential market, that's the real driver, right? It's like people buy a lot and the price is you can capitalize on that if you build a bigger building. So many of our buildings aren't even living through their designed life cycle. And that's not necessarily about, that's part of our shift around understanding the embodied energy in buildings and not tearing them down or renovating them and improving them. The other factor in big buildings we have to consider is seismic challenges. So some buildings do have to come down despite their inherent usability still, because you just can't guarantee their safety in a seismic event. But of course, it depends how big is that event, because a big one, like a really big one, will be like Christchurch. They're all coming down anyway. So I think it's a good question to be asking, but it really fits in with that mentality of conserver economy, right? Like why not just work with what you've got and think about the energy return for energy investment as opposed to the dollar return for dollar investment, which is driving a lot of these premature takedowns and reconstruction.
And further to that, that's why at least I'm interested in the flat city. The flat city is one that can be much more incrementally retrofitted, changed, change absorbed. Buildings can have accretions placed on them. So if you look at like some of the expansions of buildings in places like Kitsilano, where they've gone from one dwelling unit to three, it's essentially the same structure. They've brought new materials in, but they tend not to be concrete. It tends to be wood or somewhat more benign materials. There tends to be a higher component of labor versus resources and local industry and local developers and local carpenters who are doing that work. So if you're interested in local economy and the money staying in the region, a whole bunch of stuff comes together if you're working within a flat, therefore necessarily incremental framework.
Great, I enjoyed all the presentations. Like Bill, I'm an incurable optimist. Practically beside myself. Good vision for the future. Right. So I wonder if we could take the discourse from sort of the make-believe worlds of Copenhagen and Amsterdam to somewhere real in North America. Is Portland something closer? I know it's Gregor's third or fourth favorite city after Copenhagen and so on. There's the Can-Make and the Smoke Kippers. Is Portland smaller, slower, poorer than Vancouver?
Yeah, I know a fair amount about Portland, and maybe next time I'll avoid Copenhagen, Amsterdam, and Berlin. But the numbers for those, if you could, the fact that they are Amsterdam, Copenhagen, and Berlin, probably, it appears, obscures the fact that people walk and bike, and transit is an ancillary to walking and biking. That was the fundamental point there. And it seems to be a consistent consequence of a particular density and pattern. you know, a degree of complexity in land uses and adjacencies and what you need relative to where you live, relative to where you work. To some extent, it did grow up out of a period in history where the constraints, or what Ron Walker used to call the urgency, didn't allow you to do exaggerated things like big infrastructure systems or living far away from where you worked or all those things. But they do demonstrate that that's possible, and my point is only we actually as a city are not that far away. We're like at 7 dwelling units an acre consistently across the city. All we got to do is get to 10, 11 across the city, and we start to be the Berlin or the Amsterdam of North America. Portland, by the way, doesn't behave as well as we do on most of these indicators.
More craft breweries and travel.
There are a lot of questions back here. Nora and then maybe Mike.
My questions have to do with opportunity and bolstering the voice that Meg was talking about. And I want to link my questions to a question raised earlier around how to address the deficiency in sustainable regional thinking. And so my question is directly for Patrick and Jenny. What will it take for our collective voice to be added so that TransLink could plan and implement a more flat transportation network? And what can currently Metro Vancouver do in order to address issues, for example, accountability and democratization, in order to reduce that deficit in sustainable regional thinking?
Well, I'll take that first, and I have a one-word, one-sentence answer. You could have a chat with the person to your right. And I'm only teasing, but I think that to speak a little bit, I think Mike and others, and they've convincingly argued that the region has blocked assets that infrastructure projects such as this will unlock, and that's important to the future of the city, and I hope Mike has a chance to articulate that. But I want to emphasize that what I'm trying to talk about this time, and my desire is not to get trapped on the question of the Broadway subway this time, is a broader concept of a flat city. How that would be influenced, I personally feel like the decision around Broadway subway is the key one. I don't think it's going to go in the direction that I would like to see it go. That seems clear that there's almost unanimity that it's necessary and important and worth the money. But for me, it's a broader concept of not so much what we do in 2014 or 2018, but how does the region operate in 2050?
Okay, so I'll take a crack at this, and I'll also defer to Ken, who might speak later on some of these things. The first one, in my research, I talked a lot with Tamim Rad, who's also a graduate from planning school and is now at TransLink as the transit planner. And he is very interested in this model. Using kits as an example of where we might go with these streets that interconnect and how bicycle friendly they could be in planning for walking and cycling as your primary dominant modes, and then everything else follows from there. But I really struggle with this question around the polycentric model. An eco-city model, the flip side is these concentrated, complete, tight communities that are interspersed in theory by agricultural land, so getting back to these tighter nodes of what Bill was talking about, where your relationship between rural and urban is in a shorter loop, in a tighter function, and then the rapid transit connections. And I think this is that jumbled scale question, right? And the fact that we've never in this region had strong enough land controls at a regional level to prevent the financial incentives for development at the municipal level. And so these are where, the rubber hits the road, the bicycle tire, the foot hits the pedal, whatever it is. These are the governance structure incentive, the really technical, practical pieces, the legislation pieces that ultimately shape our region despite our good intentions, or if our good intentions are not working in sync with those things, you don't get what you envision. And I think it's a very problem, Mike and Ken, like I said, and Gary, you guys know this much better than I do, but that's how I would say it's not just about talking to TransLink. Believe me, they're aware of some of these challenges. The second one about democratization, that was a question that also came up yesterday, and I think Gordon Price actually answered that question, and that is that in this region, we looked at, before my time, not that old, but a long time ago, there was the question, should regional board members be directly elected in representing their municipal interests? And the decision was no, because what we need is people thinking about the region as a whole, elected representatives who've already been entrusted with citizens' votes, but now have to leave their parochial interests aside and look at the region as a whole. And it is a leap of trust, but I think that it can work better, and I'm not convinced that going to a ward system actually would yield any more direct democracy in this manner. I think that the people who have been entrusted have worked for the benefit of all, and at the municipal level maintain their accountability to their direct constituents. Okay. Yeah, so the other piece which Meg mentioned, and I'll hand the mic over again, it is true also, though, from the region's perspective, and I would say we have lagged at least the model of Vancouver. As a utility provider where engineers know best about how to keep people healthy, there is very limited trust in true, open, collaborative planning, at least around the utility piece. And again, maybe there's room for improvement on that, but the flip side is, people have generally had good, clean, healthy water waste management. So I don't have an answer for that piece. I think that's a worthwhile discussion about the future of the region where we go.
I mean, maybe just briefly. Yeah, I think it's going to take a lot of building comfort and confidence with the democratic model, because it is a place where local and regional governments get burned on a regular basis when they go into that venue. So finding ways for people to come together in ways that are open to being somewhat antagonistic and yet not completely flying off the rails. I think that it takes new models. It takes some innovative thinking about how to bring people together, about how to get people to talk differently and to take their positions off the table while they open their minds and not lose those positions or lose their loyalties.
A couple of things have come up that I think are really critical to this discussion. The first is the role of democracy in all of this. Democracy only functions if you have a well-informed, politically engaged population. And I think one of the greatest symbolic references to the decline is that we have now an ill-informed, politically disengaged population who really aren't taking part in our democracy in any effective sense. We saw 60% of the people voting in the last federal election, 40% of whom voted for the current government, which means 25% of the electoral body elected a government that's changing the entire nature of the country. And I think that's an atrocity, but we put up with it, and we do so silently. So what we really need to do is to begin a new discussion about what it means to live in a democracy when we're on a vessel headed straight toward an iceberg driven by people who don't even acknowledge the existence of such critters in the sea. And whether we are aware of it or not, there has been in the last 40 years a deliberate reconstruction, a social construction of our cultural narrative, away from the kinds of values and policies that gave us the middle class and the dynamics of the 50s and 60s in North America, when we talked about cooperation, a community, long-term collective interests, the common good, and so on and so forth. Those terms don't even occur in our political discourse anymore. Today it's all about competitiveness, individualism, short-term selfish actions. We've seen any number of articles. I each have a stack of about 15 articles from the Globe and Mail holding selfishness up as the real driver of civilization and so on and so forth. Well, that reconstruction of our cultural narrative is going against us. And we're seeing it explicitly unfolding in Ottawa today, where they've closed 13 scientific libraries. They've shut down the core of the environmental assessment process. They've gutted the Fisheries Act. We've seen hundreds of lakes and rivers and streams on the roots of pipelines removed from the regulatory process, all without a peep, because people are not engaged in what's going on. We're not aware that we are now the most successfully socially engineered population on the planet. And we've been socially engineered against speaking and acting in our own best long-term interests. So that's what we're really engaged in here. It's the beginnings, I hope, of an attempt, at least regionally, to turn that around, to begin a dialogue that puts the values that we all share and depend upon ultimately back on the table and get them to be exercised in the kind of political decisions that are being taken around exporting coal and natural gas and frack this and that. My goodness gracious, people. It's time to wake up to the fact.
Well, Mike had his hand up right from the beginning, so we have to...
Well, I just want to say that I disagree with all of you. And I say that as a lawyer and looking at the evidence. The evidence is that Vancouver, because we have combined buildings and transportation and energy and a whole series of other things, and we call it livability, but it's really sustainability. We've been practicing for 40 years. We have basically no single family zoning in Vancouver now. So you can do what Patrick's talking about. You can build the equivalent of a triplex anywhere in the city. We changed the zoning on all the bus routes to C2A, so you can go 3-4 stories mixed use on the bus routes. And you can get a bus every 6 blocks in Vancouver. We took out the streetcars wisely, unlike Toronto, and put in electric trolley buses. It was a brilliant decision back in the 50s and 60s. We have, because of all those things, 20% fewer cars going into the downtown because of the increase in transit. 76% of the people who live in and around the CBD area don't walk, cycle, and take public transit. They don't take a car. We have brought the GHGs per capita to 4.6. The North American average is 20 per capita. And the Greenest City Action Plan down to 3 and down to beat Oslo and Copenhagen, which are 2 best in the world. And oh, by the way, Copenhagen gets 90%, 80% of its electricity from coal burning plants. So don't hold it up as a great paragon of virtue. And we have a green building code for new buildings, and we're looking at how to retrofit. So I think your pessimism is a straw horse, frankly. I think we need a kick in the butt in 2 or 3 areas, like about $5 billion, finish the rapid transit system in the region, another 500 buses, and we would have a complete system. So I just think you're, and I see, Patrick, another 200,000 or 300,000 people, when I add up all the development around the city, is going to happen in the way you're talking about, except for a few notes here and there. And rapid transit is going to happen on Broadway. You and I agree on this to Arbutus. Disagree after that. It will cost $5 billion to finish the rapid transit system in Greater Vancouver. $50 billion in Toronto. I mean, they're so far behind us, it's unbelievable. So I'm just arguing that I'm far more optimistic than you pessimistic optimists are.
But aren't you just talking about the city of Vancouver? What about the region? That we're only talking about 30% of the population when we talk about the
Well,
city.
they were talking about the city. If you want to talk about the region, we can do that too.
But I mean, I think one of the greenest things the city of Vancouver could ever do is argue for a full-fledged streetcar network in Surrey. That wouldn't that be an incredible move to be regional, to actually think, go beyond boundary or
They are.
region.
Andy, I saw a joint presentation by the Vancouver and Surrey engineers in total agreement, and the 2 mayors in Surrey and Vancouver agreeing that we're going to combine and complete the transit system in the Lower Mainland. So that's already happening.
But which comes first? I mean,
Both. You do it over 7 years. You do the Burnaby gondola in the next year. You do
Skybus,
the 3,
not the gondola.
whatever. The 3, you do 3 in Surrey over the next 2 to 4 years, and you do whichever combination Patrick and I can argue about on Broadway in 5 to 7 years. And a third comes from the federal government, a third provincial, and a third local.
But this is the same.
This sounds like a great discussion that we should continue perhaps in our break and elsewhere. But does the panel want to have the last word? Any?
I just want to say I've learned never to argue with or debate with Mike Harcourt because I would never win. But only one point. I'm as optimistic as you, Mike. It may not have come off that way. I'm trying to express an opportunity, which, you know, compared to Oklahoma City or Los Angeles or, you know, Pittsburgh, right? We're all talking about moving things to the left 2 inches versus to the right. I mean, I think we all agree and take pride in our collective work on this region, but I think also the dialogue or the conversation needs to be constant to protect that so that we don't get in the habit of extending into the future our successes from the past. And I think we're at a point in history that's very different now, they always are, than 10 or 15 years ago. And I guess I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you so much to our panelists and to all of you for being with us today, and we will reconvene.